Here. Thanks again, everybody, for joining us for our open Q&A session with Jeff Gotel, who, as you all know, wrote the very popular and very useful book, Lean UX here. And today we had him join us because I'd read some of his work as well on adapting Lean UX for sort of distributed and remote contexts. And since the theme of our webinar series this month was about distributed design, we figured we'd have him join us here and we can discuss how to adapt Lean processes for situations in which not everybody is co-located. So yeah, we've got some great questions here already, so we can go ahead and get started. Meanwhile, while we get through these questions, you can go ahead and just type any questions you have in the Q&A box, and we'll get through as many as we can within the 1 hour time slot. But the first question, Jeff, that we actually have from me here, and I think this is a really relevant one, is he asks, when working with distributed teams across time zones, so specifically on the other side of the world, so like a huge time zone difference, how has this sort of asynchronous communication impacted your workflows? So in his experience, he says it takes a while to have a good kind of, feedback cycle going, but he's curious how you've sort of adapted to the reality of this situation.
Got it. Great question. Hey, folks, thanks so much for joining today. Amazing to see where people are joining from, which is kind of relevant to the question, right? We got folks from all over the world, different time zones. Jerry's in California, I'm assuming.
Yeah.
I'm in New Jersey at home, just outside of New York City. And so it's great to be here and talk about this stuff, because this is really in my opinion, if there are two huge obstacles inside companies to adopting a more collaborative, more cross-functional, more rapid and efficient collaboration. One is, there's organizational challenges, but I think if you can get through the foundational organizational challenges, the second one becomes remote and distributed teams, which are realities for companies really of any size at this point. Really, I think the smaller the companies these days, I think are especially the more strictly software-based ones, are defaulting to work from anywhere. So it's a great question to kick off with, and so let me start with that. My experience has been that time zones tend to really disrupt this process. Now, the fundamental difference being is how big of a time zone difference there is. If there is an opportunity for folks to see each other, even for some part of the day, some kind of overlap, the process of collaboration and real-time conversation and feedback can take place. The real challenge begins when you start to get into 8 hours, 9 hours, and anything more than that. And in my experience, the challenge there, it's extremely difficult to build any kind of real-time collaboration or feedback. And so the question specifically used the word asynchronous, and that's exactly where you end up. You end up in this asynchronous reality. And what that means is that the efficiency and the pace of learning, collaboration, and discussion falls off. And generally what that means is that folks default to documentation to have that conversation. Since you can't do it in real time, I have to send you something to react to so that when you wake up, you've got something to look at and give some feedback to. And so, look, I've as soon as you get into 8 hour, 9 hour time zone differences and beyond, it becomes very, very challenging to make this way of working successful. I have, for a long time, when Neo, my consulting company, was still in business independently, we had colleagues in Singapore, and we have offices in New York and in San Francisco and in Singapore. And unfortunately, my colleagues in Singapore were fantastic folks, and I truly enjoyed hanging out with them when I got to see them and meeting them. But working together in real time was simply not an option for us. It's a 12-hour time zone difference. It's 15 hours from San Francisco. And that's just not realistic. That's just, building that feedback loop takes 24 hours, right? Which again, is significantly better than in some organizations where it might take a week or a month to get some feedback. But if you're trying to build any kind of a real-time conversation, you have to be awake at the same time.
Right. And Jeff, just going off of that point that you made about, when you were at NEO and you had this huge time gap with people in Asia, did you find that there was any sort of adaptations that you had to make to the design process or to the way that you guys communicated or documented things to get over that sort of gap? And if you did, I'm sure people here would be curious to learn, what were some of those things that you guys implemented with some success?
Yeah, absolutely. You have to. I mean, look, again, you have to fall back to documentation because we're not speaking in real time. I can't show you, like something like, I'm sorry, I've got a little, if we're working together in real time, and forgive my fantastic wireframe here, right? But I could show you something like this, and I could say, look, here's what I mean by this, and here's what I mean by that, right? And I can walk you through this, right? If you're asleep when I create this, right, this means nothing to you. Therefore, what I have to do is spend more time on the fidelity of this, first of all. And then second of all, I have to build in some kind of documentation or notation into this. And so, look, what shape does that take? I think it really depends on how long we've been working together, how familiar we are with the project, how much time we've, so for example, if we're a relatively new team, I'm going to default to extensive documentation. And what I mean by that, I'm still not going to go to the lengths that I went to when I started out my career at AOL and we were writing 150-page, design requirements documents. But I will definitely label things either in the wireframes themselves or in the PDF or a very kind of lengthy email that says screen 1, here's what I'm thinking, screen 2 is what I'm thinking. I don't have any revolutionary tools there to make that a successful collaboration. But I think that what you'll find is that as you spend more time together as a team, that level of trust and understanding increases. And so while I'm not convinced that maybe after maybe a year of working together or something like that on the same project, well, I'm not convinced that a team that's been working together for a while can still get away with stuff as rough as this. I think you'll find that the amount of documentation that you need to make is reduced over time to describe what you're thinking about and what you're trying to convey. Also, look, I mean, at some point, you've got a living and working system at some point. And so you can move away from perhaps rougher sketches and just modify screen grabs, do some, either grab some screenshots or work through a more complex prototyping tool that allows you to articulate exactly how things are supposed to work. So that's, that is the fallback. But documentation, unfortunately, is the fallback when you're not awake at the same time.
Right. No, that's all totally valid. And we've actually experienced that same sort of evolution here at UXPin because, as many people might know, we have offices in Mountain View and then also in Poland, right? And what we noticed was, I joined about 2 years ago, and I noticed that the documentation has sort of lightened up over time. But that being said, we certainly still do face those situations where we have to over communicate, whether with fidelity or just with the comments that we annotate to a design, because that's just the way it is when you can't have a sort of back and forth kind of rapid fire session with somebody on the fly.
Yeah, I mean, look, after you've been working with folks for a while, they'll, as a designer, they'll start to understand your language, your style, your preferences. There's every designer kind of has a default set of default communication style, a default set of bag of tricks, if you will, that you go to probably first. And so if we've been working together for 6 months, I know what to expect from you after a while. And
Right.
so you have to explain it less to me. But like inevitably, you're going to have to tell me why you did something.
Right, right. And speaking of that sort of bag of tricks here, so Davers here actually has a really interesting question, and this, I'm sure this ties into some of the work that you've done running remote workshops that you've written about. But he's curious. So, do you know of any good solutions for whiteboarding with somebody remotely? So the best that he's seen is this solution here called dkit.com, and I'll type that in here into the chat box so everybody can see. And that's mostly for an iPad. And yeah, he's just curious if you use any specific tools for like remote whiteboarding.
Yeah. So the tool that I found most useful recently is Mural or Murally.
Right.
They really are building out a robust shared whiteboarding space, and they are continually enhancing that product. It's not designed as a drawing tool, as a whiteboarding tool. It does have shapes. It does have Post-its. It does have all kinds of, the kinds of stuff. I think it's designed to be more of a kind of brainstorming facilitation space.
Right.
But you can draw shapes on it, and you can manipulate those shapes. And I use Google Draw. It's crude, but everyone has access. Well, unless you're locked down by IT, everyone has access to it for the most part. It's free, and if you take whiteboarding kind of in its true spirit, Google Draw is exactly that. It's rough. It's not pretty. Very, very quickly, you can put together a few shapes. You can drop a screenshot in there, and people can draw over the screenshot. I've yet to hit the user limit on it. Not that I've put 100 people on it, but and so it's as a shared space that's available to almost everybody consistently, with relatively familiar, limited functionality. I find that Google Draw also helps as well. So those are my two go-tos when it comes to facilitating any kind of remote whiteboarding or brainstorming sessions.
Right. Right. No, I've used Miro myself too, and I would second that. I think it's probably the most robust solution that I found out there, and it really is. It's kind of a nice hybrid between something that you can attach a lot of sticky notes to, and also do some sort of rough, low fidelity drawings with, in much the same way you might on like a whiteboard with a marker.
Yeah.
And it's got a lot of like templates built in there now, so it's kind of cool to play with.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and they continue to improve. It's really impressive what they can get done in the browser. I do find that at least on my MacBook Air, the fans start spinning after a while.
Yeah.
So but I've never seen it drag a MacBook Pro down. But on an Air, it definitely starts to slow down a little bit. But that's it still works. It's just the fans definitely start to go after a while.
Right. And Laura has a question here. So in her situation, she says the majority of the team is co-located, but then there's also, of course, distributed team members. That's a very common sort of team structure we see with almost every company now. She's curious, especially for those distributed team members, how do you make them feel more included, right? So you don't end up with a sort of here versus there type of culture.
Yeah, so this is material that I've read directly from Jason Fried, who's an expert on this as well, the Basecamp 37 Signals founder, and also from my experience as well, because again, whether it's Neo or the consulting work that I've done independently over the years, it's absolutely crucial to make those team members not feel like second-class citizens in the process. And so, the recommendation for Jason and the recommendation from my experience as well is to optimize for remote. So essentially, that's the answer to that question. You can't the here and there culture is a Jason Fried thing, right? And that's exactly what happens if the overwhelming number of people work in the office and there's 2 or 3 folks that are remote, and you don't optimize for remote, you are absolutely creating 2 different cultures, and you're making your distributed folks feel like they're not part of the team, or they always have to suffer through a suboptimal experience to participate. Optimizing for a remote culture is the answer to making this work. In other words, there's always a dial-in. There's always a video conference for every call. All the notes get, everything gets recorded. Everything gets sent out at the end of the meeting. We make sure that the tools work and that everyone has access to it. I work with a client right now, and one of the components of that is a weekly team meeting where inevitably they're distributed between at least a couple of offices and folks who are working from home or whatever, plus I'm not always on site. And we burn 15 to 20 minutes, I'm not exaggerating, of every one of those hour-long meetings on the can you see me, can you see my screen, can you hear me type of thing. And it's brutal. It's brutal, and it's because we haven't optimized that meeting for a distributed culture. People don't think to try the tools out 5 minutes before to make sure that they have access to the mural or to the whatever the shared workspace is that we're using that particular day. And so that's the key, right? Everyone has a tool that they can access. Everyone knows how to use the tool. Everyone can get the tool up and running, both the connectivity as well as the shared space up and running within 30 seconds of the meeting starting. Everything gets recorded. Everything gets sent out at the end of the meeting as a recap. There's never a question about how we're getting together, right? We're always getting together on video conference, and we're always going to use this particular tool. And that's the key. Without that, you alienate the remote people, and their contribution will fall off, and the team dynamic will suffer. And I've seen this happen again and again. This gets worse and worse and worse as the time zones spread out, because inevitably, even though it's unsustainable, I saw someone mention it in the chat. Inevitably, at some point, someone's going to have to stay up late for some of these calls, right? And we can touch on that in a little bit. But if they're already staying up late or getting up early, and the technology component sucks and it's not optimized for their remote behavior, why they even wake up or stay up late to participate, right? So that's the key is if you're going to have distributed teams, even if they're not, even if you're in the same time zone, right? The default is remote, right? It's a bonus if you can get together, if a few of you can be in person in the same room, but the default is remote.
Right. You sort of almost accept that you are working from a kind of remote culture and then working backwards towards that sort of co-located, process. And that's kind of the safest way to go about it. And I think that's extremely accurate, because we went through those same headaches ourselves as a startup, in two very different time zones. That's extremely valid. And now on a related question here. So a person here is curious about timing and deadlines. And so I think this person is curious about how, in your experience, when you've worked in a distributed fashion, were there any sort of workarounds or any sort of special accommodations you had to make to ensure that people were aware of deadlines and that deliverables and assets were, it didn't slip by just because people couldn't get together as often and discuss things in person?
So so I don't think that there's a remote component. I don't think my answer for this will be the same whether you're distributed or whether you're co-located.
Right.
This is really where I fall back on some of the core Agile rituals, traditionally associated Agile rituals. So if you know anything about me, you'll know that I'm not a religious zealot when it comes to processes and rituals and that type of thing. However, there are I find tremendous value in some of the very basic and core Agile rituals, like the stand-up, the daily stand-up. And we can talk about how to do that with distributed teams in a second. And a shared backlog tool that is well-groomed and honest. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. So as long as we are connecting somehow in a stand-up situation on a daily basis, everyone knows what they're on the hook for. Everyone knows where the obstacles are and what's keeping them perhaps from hitting their deadlines or their goals. So that's the beauty of a stand-up. The stand-up itself feels like a chore when you start it, but the huge benefit of it is the accountability, right? So if you have to, regardless of whether you're on video conference or in person, if you have to get up in front of your colleagues on a daily basis and say, I'm going to miss my deadline, and that gets old really quickly, right? So that all of a sudden people are going to figure out how to help you get out of that. So that's one. The other is the kind of the visualization of the work itself, right? Hey, what are we working on? What's everybody doing? Where are the dependencies? Where are the risks? And we can move that forward as well. So stand-ups are really good for just making sure everyone knows what they're on the hook for and when it's due, and it gives them an opportunity to raise their hand and say, I'm not going to make it. Now, the other trick, of course, is a shared backlog, an honest and well-groomed backlog. And what I mean by that is, first of all, whatever tool works for you. I'm a fan of Trello as a backlog management tool. But if you're using Jira, which a lot of folks use, or LeanKit, or Pivotal Tracker, or whatever you're using, make sure that it's current. That the prioritization reflects the reality of the work, and that you're honest with yourselves about the work that you're doing, right? So as you get together for your daily stand-up and you're reviewing the backlog, if there are dependencies that may impact deadlines or commitments that somebody's made, let's talk about that. And let's say, hey, I've got a card, the next card up in the stack is coming up into the doing column is the design heavy card. And I just, as a designer, I need more time before that card gets into the doing column, right? Is it something we can swap to, maybe a more tech heavy card that we can move to the top that buys me an extra day or two, right? And so again, that answer is not remote team specific. I mean, the tools will help you do that, but even co-located teams are using those same tools. Right. But those agile rituals of the daily stand-up and an honest backlog prioritization are the key to maintaining that kind of progress and an eye on deadlines. And again, I think I'll just to complete that thought, the last agile ritual that I really like and use a lot is retrospectives. So after a sprint or a period of time or whatever, running a retrospective to get a sense of, well, what worked well in our collaboration, what didn't work well. Hey, we missed the deadline. Well, why did we miss it? Well, because of the time zone difference. We didn't. It wasn't clear when something was actually due. Right. Well, let's surface that. Or next time we put a deadline on it, right? It's 12 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time and it's midnight Singapore time or whatever, right? So that people know what it is, right? So those three rituals, distributed or not, are a great way to make sure that your deadlines are in line.
Right. And now kind of a related question, talking about rituals and getting into a rhythm of getting into communication with people. Nada here has a very interesting question, which is she's curious if you think that it's kind of a two-part question. So the first part is really that, do you feel that it's necessary for people to meet before an actual project really gets underway so that they have time to know each other? Or once that process does start to kick in and you have people in distributed scenarios, have you ever found it useful to have these sort of free meetings where people can talk and exchange more than just work, and that's a way to sort of create empathy between folks?
Yeah, so I think that it's absolutely crucial. I think it's one of the best practices that I've utilized in my career and that I've seen work well is to launch your project, especially with distributed teams, together with everybody in the same space. Bring everybody together. Bite the bullet on cost because you'll pay it anyway. You might as well just pay it up front, and you'll reap much better rewards for that investment over the life of the project. Bring everybody together to one place and do the kind of activities that you'll often find in a design sprint That's, where you're doing a lot of assumptions, declarations, hypothesis writing, design studios, prototyping, some customer development, some research, a couple of rounds of that. Hang out together in the evenings, grab some beers, grab some dinners, right? And at the end of a week effort like that, a week-long effort like that, you'll find that you've gotten to know these folks on a personal level. You've built some momentum and some camaraderie. You understand what their motivations are. You understand where their constraints are when they go back home. And so there's a greater tolerance for the increased challenge of being distributed.
Right.
There's a greater camaraderie. And I would advise that depending on the length of your project, so absolutely kick things off together, do the work together, collaborate, but also go, spend a little bit of time in the evenings together on a casual basis. So you just kind of, it's not all work, you get to hang out. And then depending on the length of the project, every so often, do that again. So whether it's once a quarter, if you can afford it, or once every 6 months at least, get the whole team back together in one place to really start to build, to kind of rekindle that camaraderie in person. That goes a super long way to it's not just the collaboration that gets better and the camaraderie, but frankly, it's the forgiveness.
Yeah.
If we've never met, and we work together, and then every time that you're connecting to our stand-up, your signal's crappy, and your voice always breaks up.
Yeah.
The tolerance for that is going to be pretty short. But if we hung out and you're like, look, I live in this area where internet is spotty at the moment, or there's heavy construction right now, right? And they're digging up all around us. And so it gets cut off periodically. Now I know that about you. You told me about where you live and what's happening in your world. And so now I have a better sense of, I have more tolerance, frankly,
right,
for the work, for the challenges of distributed work.
Right. And we've experienced the same benefits of that. So we do sort of regular employee exchanges here at UXPin, where we send people between both offices. And that helps tremendously on the product development side, where you have a lot of different personalities all working on one product, right? And people communicate differently, and it's really hard to read people in email and Slack. There's been situations where some people thought they were getting abrasive feedback, but once they met in person, they realized, you just can't gauge that accurately, from just pure reading on the screen. And so, especially for kickoffs, any sort of large releases that we're working on, we always try to get the project leads and the overall team in one place, whether that's we're going over there or they're coming over here. It's a worthwhile investment, because the alternative to that is, you just don't have a solid foundation for that sort of collaboration at all.
Yeah, and I think especially, look, if you can even if you're dealing with just separate offices, then kind of having that activity at various offices throughout the year gives everybody that shared context. Like, oh, right, I went to the Poland office. I saw what it was like. Right, those guys, they have an amazing office, but it's like that crazy tenant next door who's always hammering on the walls.
Right.
And so now I know what that banging is during calls, right? And I don't have. That's the kind of stuff that you'll never get unless you experience firsthand and together. And so that's great.
Right. And here somebody actually has a very specific kind of situation that they're curious to get your feedback on. So this person works in a fintech company where PMs, engineering, QA are all distributed across multiple continents. Or actually, sorry, in this case, one continent, but I'm assuming, different offices. So they currently struggle a lot with handover from one team to another.
Yeah.
And would you be able to provide any advice on how to smooth that handover as project progresses through the dev cycle without having to just resort to the default of a ton of documentation?
Again, I think the question here, and really it's trying to get more context around this, is how, if you distribute it across a continent, how many time zones are we crossing? I think that it really depends on which continent I'm looking. I have a big world map up here.
Right.
That's why I'm looking up here. But it really depends on which continent you're talking about. I think for a lot of them, a 3-hour, 4-hour, even a 5-hour time zone difference is manageable. I think it's manageable to have those finding a mutual time of day where we have a stand-up and we talk about things, having some shared awake time where we can have some meetings and go through some designs or go through some QA questions or handoffs. Look, the more you can use prototyping tools to convey what you're talking about, the less you have to document. That's generally the case, right? So if you can kind of show what the workflow looks like, if people can click through it, they get a better sense of what the flow is supposed to do, and again, no shortage of really good tools to do that with as well. And so I'm trying to think of really more tactical stuff than that. But set up those conversations to go, if you don't have a lot of overlap, then use the time that you do have to have very explicit conversations to talk about the experience, right? So that you can document less. And I think that inevitably you're going to have to document some part of it as you do the handoffs. But really, even the phrase handoff, right, starts to kind of betray what your process is like, right? And I don't mean that in a negative way. I'm just sort of kind of giving away a little bit, right? And if we're trying to build a cross-functional collaboration, the concept of handoff becomes less explicit, right? Because we're always kind of talking. And again, this is where being distributed starts to break that apart, right? We inevitably have to fall back to handoffs because you're not at work yet, right? When I'm going home and handing that off. So yeah, that's the key here. Is the more that you can talk in real time, the better.
Right, and we found that even trying to do more activities rather than pure documentation has been useful too. So I'll give you an example of something we tried here. We've tried this in the past few months as we've really implemented Agile processes as kind of the company standard. But one thing that we've actually tried that helped a lot with estimating for sprints and getting an idea of how much effort is required for all the different story points is we've started using planning poker, which is this exercise, and we actually found an online version of this game that you can play with people. And without getting into too many details, basically the goal is to have a way for people to individually kind of assign numbers on a scale for how much they think a certain story point or a certain user behavior, let's just say a user story, might take to build. And they put these cards down, and they don't show each other before they put it down, so that way you sort of avoid bias. But we found that by just doing a quick activity like this, where we schedule it towards, we try to find a time zone or time of day that coincides well, different people, different continents. But just by doing this activity alone, we found that helped to prevent misunderstanding and just and sort of missed deadlines, because everybody in the beginning were able to explore, a developer thinks this is going to take this long, but designer thinks this long, and why is that? We can air that out before we actually even get into doing any design or development work. And we found that helped tremendously with every part of the process afterwards.
Yeah, and planning poker, again, kind of familiar to probably hardcore Agile dev teams as an estimation tool, but your use of it is great, right? Let's get everything on the table about how heavy, how much work we actually think these ideas are, right? Because we've all been there, right? You've got a design that requires a checkbox, right? And from a design point of view, you're like, okay, checkbox, done, right? But from a development point of view, that's the implications of ticking that box is 6 months worth of work, right? And vice versa, right? You might have a kind of a very complicated front end design to an element of the system, but a talented front end developer could knock it out in a half day, right? So that's a really great way to use that tool. And we don't have to debate the merits of estimation here today. We shouldn't, because we'll just take up the rest of the time. Right. But as a tool to kind of get those conversations to happen, instead of the designer just kind of sitting there quietly and saying, okay, that's a point, Well, it's not a point, right? It's 5, right?
Yeah.
So I think it's 5 times more difficult than you think it is. Well, let's talk about why that is. That's great. Really, really nicely done. And it's cool that they've brought this online. I see the link in the.
Yeah, and it's free to use for folks too. And I can't recommend this enough because it, even though you're not going to come up with 100% accurate estimations, it's at least you're almost guaranteed to reveal where those huge disparities are, and that at least you can address those early on instead of discovering them in sprint 15 or something. And let's see here. So somebody here actually has a really interesting question too. They're curious on if you have any tips for remote managers and managing remote designers. So if you have any sort of advice in regards to productivity and communication for, let's say, I'm assuming in this case, a design leader who is remote and having to manage other folks on their team, and they're not all in one office together.
That's a really good question. And I'm trying to think of something. Look, the key, I think, if you're managing a remote group of designers is to provide a forum where all those designers can get together on a regular basis and talk about not only the challenges of the actual design work that they're doing, but the challenges of integrating with the rest of their teams because we're distributed, right? So finding, again, a video conferencing solution, not Hangouts. Only because of the inconsistency of how well it works and who can connect, right? But some kind of a video conferencing tool that allows everyone to get together consistently on a regular basis and discuss things. Again, optimizing for that remote culture, right? So if we're going to be a distributed design team, that means that when we get together as a team, it has to work. Like, I don't want to spend, I remember, at Neo, we used to do all hands between a bunch of folks, and Hangouts has a finite number of folks that can be in there. So it's kind of like, who's going to drop out, right? Or who doesn't get to be in the meeting today because we hit the max, or who can consolidate, or who can get together, right? And I think that it's that kind of stuff that starts to kind of gnaw at the morale and the productivity and the engagement of a distributed team. And so finding a tool where everybody can just log in and be in this meeting together. Right. And I think that also doing your one-on-ones with video conferencing, right? To make sure that you can see each other, that you can read body language, that you can, get a sense of levels of engagement. We used to do this. There was one team I worked on that was distributed. It's all East Coast, to be perfectly, all East Coast time zone team between Atlanta, New York, and Columbus, Ohio. And we would leave in this case, it was a Google Hangout, but we'd leave a Google Hangout on all day.
Right.
For the team. But what you could do this for the design team, for example. You could do this for your project teams. But we just kind of leave it on all day so that there was kind of always a portal to the team between, distances that you could I could yell over to Jerry and be like, "Hey, Jerry," and you would hear me, even though you were in Ohio or you're in Atlanta. And that provided a level of immediacy that was very, very helpful. So we're all kind of working in the same room together. And if we need to talk to each other, we can do that. And you can kind of see if someone's there and ready to talk, right? They're at their desk and their microphone is unmuted or something along those lines. So that's one tactic that also worked well. One thing that I would recommend against, and I remember that I used to have this neighbor. This is the key, right? We're all on Slack or HipChat or whatever you're using, right, for kind of chat conversations. But when I used to work at AOL, I had a neighbor who worked. She wasn't at AOL. I think it was MCI. This is a long time. MCI before it became Verizon, right? They were a distributed team, and her boss kept track of her based on whether or not she was signed in to Instant Messenger, right? And so that was essentially her like punching her time card. Like, I'm signed into work, and now I'm not signed into work. And if you didn't like turn on Instant Messenger by a certain time of day, he'd be like, where are you, right? So
Right.
I don't recommend that tactic. that fosters low morale and less engagement. But that again, creating that those shared live spaces goes a long way.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense, and that tactic of having sort of an always on sort of a hangout is actually a very useful and sort of clever tactic, because that you're essentially creating a true virtual culture in a sense, because it's everybody's, everyone's connected to each other at once. And I know there's other tools too. Squiggle, I think, is another tool that I think that it's designed specifically for that.
Yeah. And Slack bought Screen Hero, so video conferencing on Slack is inevitable, right? So that's coming too.
Right. And actually, speaking of video conferencing, so Katie has a really quick question, which is she's curious if you have a favorite sort of video conferencing tool for different size meetings, whether that differs between one-to-one, working in a group of 5, or sort of all hands situation. Yeah. Is there any tool or set of tools that you enjoy?
Yeah, so honestly, Zoom, the tool we're using right now, is my current go-to. It's working really, really well right now for me. I've worked with some companies who use Blue Jeans.
Blue Jeans.
A horrible name, but that seems to work really, really well as well. But my sense is it's expensive. I don't know. I haven't looked into it, but only because the companies that I've seen use it are typically larger companies. But Blue Jeans has worked well. Zoom seems to work really well. Hangouts is free. For a long time, I was using Appear.in. I still like it. I think they're positioning themselves more as a chat platform, kind of like an instant messaging platform, as opposed to a business tool. But as far as a free tool with a decent app for your phones, I like Appear.in, but it's definitely it's taken a back seat to Zoom lately, which is kind of my go-to, and then Hangouts, inevitably if I have to. But I just find it to be as problematic as it is useful. And the UX of just starting and launching and inviting people to a Hangout is brutal.
Right.
And, it offends me.
And the reliability is not as great. With Zoom, we found that across continents that the connectivity is almost flawless. From a Zoom standpoint.
Yeah, and look, the kind of the granddaddy of it all, GoToMeeting, works. The UX is tough. You have to suffer through it, but once you get the meeting going, it works really well. So and that's what they do for a living. So that's good.
Right. And Brian Lee here actually has a really interesting question about documentation. So Brian here says that even though working together live is useful, wouldn't proper documentation still be useful, in addition to weekly or daily meetings, especially if folks are juggling multiple projects and it becomes hard to track everything? So in his experience, he's found that the details are really important for teams like QA to ensure that the implementation matches the specification, especially when you're talking about a multitude of projects. And I imagine this complexity increases when you get into the enterprise space. So he says that things can get hectic, things can get missed, and a properly annotated wireframe can help set things in stone. So he's curious if you have any thoughts on dealing with, not just 1 or 2 projects, but let's say you've got a complex set of projects, maybe even for a complex product, right? So if we think about, you've got multiple product or multiple projects, maybe they're enterprise grade, and they're also distributed. In that case, is there sort of a smart way to go about documentation so that you're not going back to these 100-page spec documents? Is there a balancing point that you found that works?
Yeah, and so again, I think that my answer is not necessarily going to be specific to distributed teams.
Yeah.
I think, and again, I always try to look at kind of the root cause here, and the root cause is that you're juggling multiple projects as a designer. And if you're freelance, that's one thing, that's your choice. But if you are If you're working in-house, it's indicative of a staffing model that's inevitably going to be stretched to its limits, right? You know that if you're supporting more than, I'm going to say two, but I even think two is too many, but if you're supporting more than two projects as a designer, you are in a tough spot, right? Because you come in every day and you've got at least three number one priorities to deal with, which means you're picking up at least two people every day by coming into work, right? So I think that, yes, I think inevitably, if you're supporting multiple projects, if you're not dedicated to a team in a continuously collaborative way, if you have to jump between video conference to video conference, and yes, inevitably you have to document that stuff, and you have to so that you can push that off, hand that off essentially to that dev team, and then move on to your next number one priority and get that work done, right? So I think that the root issue here is a staffing situation, not a distributed team situation. Now, that being said, let me be clear. I do want to make one quick note about documentation, and it's this. I know I wrote an article called Lean UX Getting Out of the Deliverables Business, right?
Right.
And that should be our focus, right? Our focus should be about designing products and experiences, not documents that people end up not consuming and not implementing. That said, many of us work with clients or organizations that require thorough documentation. And that's fine. Let's just do that once we've made all of our decisions, right? So the goal is getting to those decisions and those implementations and those solutions faster. And then once those things are live or being coded and are going to get shipped, yeah, if you need to document it, let's document it then, right? But if we're looking for a faster pace of iteration, right? If we increase the amount of collaboration and conversation, we reduce the amount of documentation. So that's just want to make a clarification there.
Right. And I think one point that we've discovered ourselves is that it's not so much about, Lean isn't about no documentation. It's really just about like better documentation. I think is sort of the spirit of what you were talking about in the book and also in that article, which is like things in which, like if you can get it across in a conversation or a quick meeting and that avoids 10 pages of documentation, by all means do that. But what we found is obviously UXPin itself is considered an enterprise product because we only people at work, designers, PMs, etc., use our product. And even though it's a fairly complex product with that, we found that one form of documentation or one tactic to documentation we found was useful is we have we treat our requirements document as almost like a Wikipedia portal. So instead of laying out every last detail in that documentation, we link out to where more information can be found. And we try to rely as much on annotated prototypes as possible because we found that that's just a much more live and interactive way to understand a system than to write out 30 pages and have somebody in QA review that against your latest build. They don't get that same understanding for the look and feel and how it should behave and function.
Yeah.
So by doing that, we've been able to eliminate the need for really heavy documentation. But again, that doesn't mean that we do no documentation. Right? We just figure out a way to do it better.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's really interesting, right? I mean, and I completely agree with your suggestion of a shared document space, right? So whether you're using a wiki or whether you're using Docs or the Microsoft suite of products, right? It's so interesting, right? I mean, when Google Docs first came out, we were like, why would I ever want to share my document with anyone?
Right.
And today, like, I can't imagine creating something and not sharing it with the people that I'm working with, especially since I work from home when I'm not on the road. So, I mean, you're looking at my team, right? This is me, and the team is distributed. And so it's a terrific opportunity for everybody to see, for everybody to contribute, to ask questions, and to maintain a continuous conversation in those spaces, right? And I think most of those tools work really well. Whether again, it's like Dropbox has one too, right? Dropbox Paper,
yeah,
as well. So interesting how that's changed the way that we work.
Yeah, exactly. And let's see here. So Mihir has a quick question here, which is, personally for you, in the way that you work with companies, Do you ever schedule meetings specifically just to talk about process and team dynamics related stuff rather than just the work on the product itself?
Retrospectives. I mean, in short, that's the meeting that handles that.
Yeah.
We cover work-related, project and product-related stuff, and then we also talk about process and how things are going. And again, at the risk of coming off like a religious zealot, I'm not. I really like stand-ups. I like good backlog grooming, and I like retros for continuous improvement. Right. So I think that's the meeting that does that.
Right. Yeah, that totally makes sense. And so one question I have here that I thought would be interesting to get into is, it's been almost, let's say, I think at this point, it's almost been 5 years since Lean UX first came out. In that time, I imagine you've helped, countless companies improve their design process. In your experience, have you found one consistently difficult part of that process to implement with, given all the clients you've had over the years and as you try to help them simplify their process? Is there like a particular friction point that you've seen almost always comes up?
And it's interesting. It's again, not specific to distributed teams, but the most consistent challenge is changing the definition of success or the definition of done for the teams working on these products. That's by far the biggest challenge. And in fact, why we've written a second book, not just a second edition of Lean UX, but actually the book is called Sense and Respond, and it's a business book that'll be out next year. It's really to speak to the managers of these teams, help them think about why they need, how they need to manage differently. And at the core of it is changing the measure of success from outputs to outcomes, right? So not focusing on shipping features, but focusing on making customers successful and then measuring that behavior as the definition of done and as the definition of success. And that's by far the most challenging thing, because as you kind of trace it, if you do a root cause analysis of why that doesn't work, where you inevitably hit is the CFO's office, right? It starts off with how projects are budgeted, how teams are incentivized, and then how managers are bonused, and then what they manage to and how they assign work. And so it really kind of cascades throughout the organization. But that's by far the toughest shift, right? Because everyone's so used to saying, we got to ship the app, we got to ship that feature, we got to do the thing. And very few people are really thinking about it from, we've got to drive, we've got to make our customers more successful, right? They've got to get home to their kids' soccer game more quickly, so they got to finish work more successfully, right? Very few companies have made that shift. And so that's by far the most difficult part of it.
No, I agree. I've done a couple of sort of discovery interviews with design managers and design leaders in this space. And I think what you touched on is very relevant, because with the exception of a few companies, like for instance, Airbnb, who has an extremely mature design practice, and they have individual product teams and even whole different units within design, all having different OKRs that are related to product goals and very clear sort of business metrics. I found that a lot of design managers are still sort of held to these kind of vague, metrics, and because design is such a subjective practice, right? The most objective thing oftentimes for people to measure is the velocity and quantity of output. And so a lot of times that, while it's not necessarily A to B, a point A to point B relationship between a design or a feature and, a UX decision and the immediate business impact, it becomes easier for companies to just default to, okay, well, how quickly did we ship this, and how many releases did we get done this quarter versus last quarter? And because design managers are held to that standard, then suddenly that whole culture changes as a result of that.
Yeah, and look, the challenge I think is, and I'm going to disagree with one thing that you said.
Yeah.
While there are subjective elements to design choices that we make, I think design it's a tool that we wield like anything else, like code, like copy, like marketing,
right,
to make our customers successful, and it has a very explicit business purpose.
Right.
Right. And in digital, in software, you can prove your point. You can prove that, hey, I made it red, not because I thought red looked good, right? But because red and this particular workflow and this particular choice of elements makes our customers more successful. And I can prove that to you with data, right? But yes, I'm making some subjective choices, but they're also based on, some brand and brand promise and et cetera, right? But also we're focused on building a holistic experience that delivers some kind of outcome for the customer and hopefully for us as a business. And I can demonstrate that, right? So I think that's the risk. The risk is that most people still see it as subjective, and they're like, and that's kind of where the kind of the haphazard feedback comes in, like, oh, you made it red, well, I like blue, so go ahead and make it blue.
Right.
But, come on, like that's and so that's really where you've got to kind of be back and be like, look, no, here's why I made these decisions, right? They're based on these elements, this data, this best practice, or this approach that we've learned, and then you try to drive the point that it's much more than subjective choices. Yeah,
absolutely. I think here at UXPin we've got a lot of OKR based sort of structures that we have with the designers and managers and things of that sort. But yeah, from my conversation with some teams, it just seemed like the design leaders there were still sort of treated as mostly people and process managers, which is a very dangerous sort of way to approach design. I think if outcomes aren't the first thing that somebody is sort of responsible for, and the other stuff falls underneath that, that's when you get into a lot of these situations, which I think resulted in some of these questions that came up today, right? A lot of these sort of process-based questions. People are doing a ton of different projects at once, and it all kind of stems from what you talked about, which is like at that executive level, some misunderstanding is happening.
Yeah.
And to sort of shift gears here, this kind of goes back to some previous discussions we had. I realized this question sort of dropped off, but Katie was curious. I know we talked a little bit about some whiteboarding tools, but outside of whiteboarding tools, have you found any other tools that are useful for, let's say, if you want to do a design thinking exercise or workshop, or if you want to run a retrospective, are there any other tools that you can think of that might be useful besides Google Drawing and Mural and Zoom?
Yeah. Some again, my go-to on that is Mural for most cases, but the folks out at DevJam in Minneapolis have a tool called Cardboard. I think it's cardboard.it, which is a kind of a virtual Kanban board that works really well. There was a tool for a while called stickies.io that I used for that kind of stuff as well. Some of my corporate clients use LeanKit, which is a kind of a Trello competitor. But Trello is good for that kind of stuff. If you're corporate and you've got a subscription to LeanKit, it's good for some of that stuff. That's really it. I think my go-to for remote facilitated design thinking brainstorming stuff is generally Mural, just because that's their focus. They're really kind of hitting that hard, and it's showing the tool works.
Yeah, no, I agree. What I like about Mural is it kind of brings in, it takes all of that sort of fuzzy early part of design and puts it under one roof. So, and I think that's very natural, because a lot of people, when you are in that early part of design, it's much easier to not have to switch between tools, right? You kind of like having one big sandbox to play with. So yeah, I would definitely echo that point about Mural as well. And now, so we're going to take the last question here, because we're hitting the hour here. But as I do that, I'm going to run a quick poll here for everybody. And we've been doing this in every webinar. This helps to get a gauge on the sort of issues that people face in the design process. So I'm going to launch the poll right now. And it'd be great if everybody could participate and complete the one question that I'm putting up here. But as we get into the last question here,
and really quick, let's do the last question, and then I'm going to have to jump because I have another call at the top of the hour. But I did want to say that I'm going to put my email address here in the chat. And so if you didn't get your question answered and you want to email me, feel free to follow up via email, and I'd be happy to share any insights that I have via email as well.
Yep.
And two really quick plugs before we take that last question is one, second edition of Lean UX book is now available. So we've updated it significantly since the first edition, but you can get that now. And then Sense and Respond is out in February, which is going to be great. So read it for yourself and then buy a copy for your boss because they need it too. So.
Yeah. And we'll be sharing links to both of these books on our social channels as well throughout the month. So so in addition to the links I dropped here, everybody can kind of get updated on that. The last question that I would have here is, have you found that there's any particular UX exercises or workshops that translate really well for distributed design? But obviously, not all of them are going to work, right? But are there a few sort of go-tos that you have found to be very effective?
That's a great question. I'm trying to think what has been the most effective distributed exercise. I've successfully pulled off affinity mapping exercises in a variety of different tools. I've done it in Google Docs. I've done it in Mural. I've done it in what else? We've done it in Trello. It's not really a design. It's a design thinking exercise. It's not really a design exercise. I've done remote design studios as well, and those are getting easier to do now that everybody's got everybody can take photos of their stuff in their pocket, or we get good tools like Zoom. So I think you can do design studio, especially if you can kind of work individually and then converge in a shared white space successfully. And then I've done affinity mapping as a design thinking exercise successfully in a variety of situations.
Yep, and I'm dropping those links in here too. I've read your articles, Jeff, and these go into extreme detail. So folks, if you guys are curious about how to do better workshops with distributed teams, the two links I dropped here have been the two most thorough ones that I could find on the topic, and I highly recommend you check them out. Jeff walks through how he does these exercises with a lot of sort of visuals and examples. It's more or less a step-by-step sort of playbook. So worth checking those out there in the chat box. And since we are at the top of the hour here, that'll be the last question. And you guys have Jeff's email that he put in the chat box there. So if you want to follow up with him. Otherwise, Jeff, thank you so much for joining the session. It was great having you. And thanks everybody for joining. There were some fantastic questions here.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me. And again, ping me with any follow-ups, and I look forward to seeing you all someday soon.
Great. All right. Take care, Jeff.
See you. Bye.